Do you have a lot of green art supplies? It's a cootie catcher. An argument could be made that I have too many, and today I'm going to be using every single one of them to make an illustration. Here goes nothing. At this point, I've got a lot of experience using all of my art supplies in a single color. You know, I do my little swatching, I figure out what all the colors look like, then I start thumbnailing. But green may or may not be a creative color, but I, for one, had no idea what I was going to draw. So I started doodling green things like grass, leaves, the Incredible Hulk, and Mike Wazowski. You know, everything you think of when you think of the color green. I dabbled with a few other ideas, finally resulting in this little thumbnail down here in this bottom left corner all by itself. And I was ready to finally start the illustration. But not so fast. I'm not going to be drawing it in portrait. I'm going to be drawing in landscape. I will have all of the art supplies listed in the description below, including the paper. But first we're starting it off with this green Cold Erase colored pencil. It's a good place to start because it's erasable, and if I make any mistakes, I can obviously remove them and try again. The sketching stage is not only my favorite part of any illustration, but it also could be argued is the most important because it's where you took a blank page and you turn it into something. You have to make a lot of decisions and you're laying down all the groundwork for your final illustration. I started with the actual character. When I did the thumbnail, it included like a background, and when I started sketching it, I, for some reason, just like put on my blinders and started drawing the character. I think it's because there's all that foreshortening, and I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to go about that, but the character turned out pretty good. So then I finally started adding in some of the leaves and the greens and the shrubbery all around the character so that they look engulfed. The next art supplies I used was this Americana acrylic paint in the color Citron Green. I use this color a lot, and I don't even just mean to fill in the entire background, which I did, but I end up coming back to this color a lot because it is one of the brightest, lightest greens, and it's opaque, so it comes in really handy later on. Next, I use this sap green golden open acrylic paint, so it's slow drying, and I actually mix this a little bit with the Americana paint at sometimes, but this color was really cool because it's just so much darker than the last paint that I was using, so I can put in these super contrasting dark shadows, and I love it. Now that I have my base layer of those two acrylic paints, I waited overnight for it to dry because I use that slow drying open acrylic paint. And you'll know it's dry when you can do your handy dandy technique of using your actual hand and just batting the canvas. So tacky, what the heck? For the sake of productivity, I decided to ignore the wet bits and move in with this Copic sketch marker in the color G0000, which I lovingly like to call Goo. Now this, unlike the acrylic paint that I mentioned earlier, is my actual lightest toned green art supply that I own, but it's not opaque, so I have to be very careful about how I use it. I decided to use it as kind of like a skin base tone. I kind of just used it to figure out where shadows might be. You end up not being able to see this by the end, but I do think it was helpful for just laying out the groundwork. Next, I used another Copic sketch marker. This one is G00. Can you guess what I call this one? Fred. This one I took extra care to add shadows to the skin, so you can see I put like a pretty large one underneath the knee. I'm still kind of visualizing where the light source is because I kind of messed up and didn't decide on that before, so it's something I kind of struggle with for the whole drawing, but by the end I think I figured it out. After Fred, I used this green Posca pen, which is an opaque acrylic marker, and I used this to add a couple extra shrubs to the left of the drawing. I wanted to have something that came up and overlapped over the character so she looked behind it. I kind of created some tangents when I did it, so I'll keep working on that. Then I just made sure that I evenly distributed the color around the drawing so it didn't look out of place. Then I used these three Ohuhu art markers. They're actually 3 different tones. There's like a mid-tone, a light tone, and a dark tone, so it was like perfect for adding in the shadows and starting to coloring in the character. So I used the darkest one to color in the underside of the hat. I used the mid-tone one a little bit more for shading and adding like a separate tone in there and some shadows, including some shadows that the leaves above her were casting onto her body. Then I actually switched back to that darker marker and I used the bullet nib and started adding in the line art to the drawing. I don't have a very dark fine point green pen, so this worked pretty well in a pinch. This next art supply I've had since I was 14. This is the green Papermate highlighter. This color's bright. It highlights things. At first I colored in those two big leaves in the top left of the drawing, but whew, this color, I'm not sure it fits into the color scheme. So I didn't do much else with this, and I vowed to cover it over with something else. The something else was not this green ultrafine Sharpie, but it is the art supply I used next. This is much finer than the Ohuhu art marker that I had used for line art previously. So in some of the sections that I had saved for something thinner, I used this Sharpie, and I was actually able to fix a lot of the mistakes I made with the large, clumsy bullet nib. This next Ohuhu art marker is pretty cool because it has a brush nib. And I used this to add some tone to the shorts. I like this color because it had a bit of a different hue than some of the other greens that I already had in the drawing. Then I used another Ohuhu brush marker. This one's a little bit darker, and I used this to add darker leaves around the drawing, and also adding texture to a lot of the leaves. Oh, I also used this to color in her shirt. I decided it needed a little bit more contrast between the skin and the shorts, as well as her hair, so I thought this darker color would work really, really well for that. Next, I'm going to use this core watercolor in the color green gold, and I tried to use this to tone down that highlighter green leaves. First, I just layered it over top, and then I also layered it over top of her shirt to kind of spread that color throughout the illustration. Next up is this Amsterdam acrylic marker. It's kind of like a Posca pen, but a different brand, so it's opaque. Its hue is actually a little bit more on the blue side compared to some of the other markers, so I just used it around the shirt for just a little fun hue shift. Oh, this is one of those moments when I detour and go back to that Americana acrylic paint, and I just went over the two big leaves there because, again, I just didn't like them. While that was drying, I moved on to this fine point dark green Sharpie, and I used this to add some more texture and detail to some of the leaves, adding those little line things that leaves have. The veins of the leaf, that's it. Oh, and then here I thought I had made a big mistake, but it actually, I think, really improved the drawing. I went back and used that green gold watercolor, and I went over a lot of the skin. This just adds some tone there and a little bit of warmth instead of that white paper shining through, and I think it just makes the character look a lot more alive. But then when I moved on to the legs, I was a little bit more sparse with it, and I feel like this helps make the face look more like it's in shadow and underneath those leaves, and then the legs are getting a little bit more sunlight, so I'm very happy with this decision. Finally, moving on to some more art supplies, I'm using these two Ohuhu brush markers, and I use them to continue to add detail to the leaves, like little spots that the bugs had eaten through and more veins and things like that. Then I use these two matching Sharpies, an ultrafine and a fine point, and I use this to add just a slight more shading to the character, just in little small sections that I thought needed a little extra oomph. And then if it needed to be extra small or ultra fine, as Sharpie likes to call it, I used the little one. Then I moved on to these two watercolor pencils, both by Derwent. I used the Inktense one in the color Field Green to add a little bit of texture to that front leaf there, as well as just some more shading and freckles. In some of the places where I put shading, I also grabbed a paintbrush with some water and I just kind of spread them out. And this is a very saturated green, so it added a fun effect. Then for the other one, which is a graphitint in the color Ivy, I used this for just little grass textures in the grass. I really like the way these look. It's cute and cartoony, and I think the color suited that acrylic paint really well. We're getting near the end here, but I'm going to try to speed it up, so I'm going to use these three Copic sketch markers. We have G05, G29, and G99. Using the darkest one, since it is transparent and dark, I used it to add some shading behind the leaves and behind the leg, and kind of just even tone some of the paint that I had used to shade, just evening out that tone so there isn't so much texture there. G05 I used to add some more shading to the skin. It's a lot darker than some of the other things I'd used to shade the skin, so it worked really well for those deeper shadows and adding more contrast. Then G95 is very desaturated, so it works really well just pulling some of the color out of some of those shadows. So I kind of just overlapped some shadows that I had already colored in. All right, another detour. Going back to that acrylic paint and adding more shadows over the character to kind of try to make her look deeper in the vegetation. After that, I used this green Bombay Dr. Peach Martin India ink, and I used this with a paintbrush and focused it towards the top half of the character's body, adding more and more shadows, just trying to make them look like they're deep under these leaves and pushing the atmosphere of the illustration. And by focusing all of these shadows towards the top half of the body, it just pushes it backwards and deeper into, again, the vegetation. And I very quickly fell in love with the contrast between this color and that really neon acrylic paint. Just look how they look together. They're so saturated and beautiful. All right, we're heading into the final stretch here. These are 3 Ohuhu fine liner brush pens. I use these kind of the same way I've been using everything. When we get near the end, things get a little repetitive because I'm just trying to consume art supplies. But I basically just use them to add more shadows and try to push the contrast. Next up, I'm using this Uniposca emerald green paint pen. And at first I just started in like the top corner. I'm like, I'll just draw a couple of leaves. But then I fell in love with this color because it is the bluest green I've used yet. And I realized I could use this to fix a mistake that had been bugging me from the beginning. And that is that her hat is really, really dark and it kind of blends in with that really dark shadow. So if I paint over the hat with this blue-green, it creates contrast with the hue and makes it show up without it being too bright. I'm really happy with that. Like, it's still green. It looks blue compared to all these other greens, but obviously the marker is very green if it was used on its own. Next, I'm using this Ohuhu acrylic paint pen. This is just like a Posca pen, but it's Ohuhu. I don't think they even sell them anymore. I'm kind of bummed. I like them. I use this to deepen up the vegetation in the bottom left, because you can use this to paint over some of the really dark shadows because it is opaque. And then finally, the last art supply, we have the Americana acrylic paint in the color Bluegrass Green. And what I use this for is to add some hue shifts and also to kind of fix her shirt, because I've had that shadow over her shirt. But what I don't like about it is just the way it's hitting her, because if a shadow was hitting you, you know, it goes around your curves, whereas this one is just like, it's still the same shape as if it wasn't hitting her. So I use this to block that out and kind of remove the shadow, but I mixed it with water, so it was a little bit opaque, so you can still kind of see the shadow. It like shows through just a little bit, so there's still a shadow there, but it's not as annoying. And then I just went back and used some of the other art supplies, just finished up little bits and bobs, made sure it looked the way I wanted, and then this is what it looked like. Okay, I'm really happy with this. I love the shadows. It makes me want to like try this again, but obviously plan out the shadows before I just start painting them in. But it was also kind of fun and spontaneous, so I enjoyed myself. Thanks for watching the video and observing me using every single green art supply that I own. If you do something similar, feel free to tag me. I'd love to see what you come up with. Yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys all next week, and I hope you have a delicious evening full of waffles. Bye! Pick a color. Green? Green.